There comes a moment when the noise of others no longer sounds like guidance, but like weight. A heavy, uninvited hand pressing down on the fragile architecture of your becoming. You begin to notice how often you bend, not out of truth, but out of the quiet hunger to be seen, to be accepted, to be told that you are enough by voices that were never meant to define you. And yet, there is another kind of life waiting beneath that hunger. A life where silence is not punishment but permission. Where being alone is not abandonment but arrival. In that space, you do not disappear. You unfold, slowly, deliberately, as if remembering a language you were always meant to speak, but were taught to forget. The world will always offer you mirrors, but not all of them are honest. Some distort, some flatter, and some fracture you into versions that are easier to approve of. But there is a deeper mirror, one that does not ask for applause or agreement. It only asks for truth, and in its reflection you are not smaller, not louder, not more pleasing. You are simply real. True solitude is often misunderstood as emptiness, as if being alone means something has been taken away from you. But in its deeper reality, solitude is not a void. It is a return. It is the moment when the constant interference of outside voices begins to fade, and what remains is something far more honest, your own voice, speaking without competition. For so long, people live surrounded by expectations, opinions, comparisons, and silent judgments that slowly shape how they think, how they act, and even how they feel. In that crowded mental space, it becomes difficult to distinguish what is truly yours from what has simply been absorbed over time. Solitude interrupts that confusion. It strips away the external noise until there is nothing left to perform for, nothing left to impress, and nothing left to prove. At first, this silence can feel uncomfortable. Without validation, without feedback, without someone else reflecting your worth back to you, there is a strange uncertainty. Many rush to fill that space again, through social approval, constant communication, or distraction, because the absence of external voices can feel like loss. But if you stay within it, something begins to shift. You start to notice that beneath the noise there was always a quieter presence, one that never depended on applause to exist. That presence is your own awareness, your own thoughts, your own instincts that were always there, but often overshadowed. In this state, you begin to hear yourself more clearly, not just in words, but in truth. You recognize what you actually feel, instead of what you were told to feel. You begin to understand what you actually want, instead of what you were conditioned to chase. Solitude reveals the difference between inherited identity and authentic selfhood. It is not about rejecting people or disconnecting from life. It is about separating your inner truth from external influence so that when you do connect with others, it is no longer from need but from choice. Over time, the discomfort of being alone transforms into familiarity, and that familiarity becomes strength. You stop treating silence as something to escape and start recognizing it as a space where clarity grows. Decisions become less reactive, emotions become less dependent on approval, and confidence begins to form not from being seen, but from seeing yourself without distortion. In this way, solitude becomes a kind of inner restoration, where the scattered pieces of identity slowly return to coherence and the voice you hear most clearly is finally your own. Detaching from validation is often mistaken for becoming cold toward people, as if stepping away from approval means stepping away from connection. But in truth, it is not rejection of others. It is release from dependency. It is the quiet decision to stop outsourcing your sense of worth to reactions, opinions, and judgments that were never designed to fully understand the depth of who you are. When a person depends heavily on validation, their identity begins to shift shape depending on who is watching. Around some they shrink, around others they perform, and in that constant adjustment, the self becomes less like a foundation and more like a reflection, changing with every passing gaze. This dependence does not happen suddenly. It grows slowly, often unnoticed, through moments where approval feels rewarding and disapproval feels like a threat. Over time, the mind begins to associate acceptance with safety and rejection with failure. So decisions are no longer guided by inner truth, but by anticipated reactions. A person starts asking not, is this right for me? But will they approve of this? And in that subtle shift, authority over one's life quietly moves outward. Detachment begins when this pattern is seen clearly, not judged, not fought, but recognized. There is a powerful moment in awareness when you realize that no matter how carefully you shape yourself for others, approval is never permanent and never guaranteed. It comes and goes depending on moods, perspectives, and projections that have little to do with your actual worth. This realization does not create bitterness. It creates space. Space to step back from the exhausting effort of constantly adjusting your identity to remain acceptable. To detach from validation is to return authority back to yourself. It is learning to act from alignment rather than approval. It means making choices that may not always be understood, but are deeply rooted in personal truth. At first, this can feel like vulnerability, because without external confirmation, you are left alone with your decisions. But that aloneness is not emptiness. It is responsibility. It is the moment you begin to stand behind your own life without needing someone else to sign off on it. As this practice deepens, something remarkable happens. The urgency to be liked begins to fade, not because people stop mattering, but because their opinions stop defining direction. You begin to observe others without being controlled by their reactions. Praise no longer inflates you, and criticism no longer collapses you. Instead, both become information rather than identity. In that balance, emotional freedom begins to grow. Eventually, detachment from validation becomes a form of stability. You are no longer easily shaken by approval or disapproval, because neither has final authority over your sense of self. You start to trust your own perception more than external reflection. And in that quiet shift, life becomes less about being accepted and more about being aligned with what feels true from within. The need for approval often begins as something innocent, a natural desire to be seen, understood, and accepted by others. But when it grows unchecked, it slowly becomes a subtle force that reshapes identity itself. A person begins to measure their worth not by their own inner certainty, but by how often they are affirmed. In this condition, life turns into a quiet performance where every action is filtered through the question of how it will be received. Nothing is done purely for its own truth anymore. Everything is adjusted for response. Over time, this creates a life that may look socially successful on the outside, yet feels internally fragile because it is built on shifting opinions rather than grounded self-awareness. When approval becomes the center of identity, authenticity begins to erode. A person no longer expresses what they truly feel, but what is most likely to be accepted. They begin to edit themselves constantly, removing parts that might cause rejection and amplifying parts that gain praise. This editing is not always conscious. It becomes automatic, a survival strategy in social environments where acceptance feels necessary for belonging. But in the process, something essential is lost. The rawness of being fully oneself without calculation. This constant performance creates exhaustion. To maintain it, a person must continuously scan their environment, reading faces, anticipating reactions, adjusting tone, language, and even beliefs. It becomes a quiet labor that never ends, because approval is never stable. What pleases one person may disappoint another, and what is admired today may be criticized tomorrow. So the individual remains trapped in motion, always adapting, never arriving at a stable sense of self. Gradually, identity becomes fragmented. There is the version presented to family, another for friends, another for work, and sometimes even smaller variations within each. Each version is slightly altered to fit expectations, and over time it becomes difficult to locate the original self beneath all the adaptations. This fragmentation creates a deep internal tension, a feeling of being divided between who one is and who one is expected to be. Yet beneath this cycle, there is always a quieter awareness observing it, a part of the self that notices how exhausting it is to constantly perform, how unstable it feels to depend on external approval for internal peace. When this awareness grows stronger, the illusion begins to weaken. It becomes clearer that validation, while comforting in the moment, cannot provide lasting identity. It can affirm behavior, but it cannot define essence. The realization that performance has replaced presence becomes a turning point. It exposes how much energy has been spent trying to maintain an image rather than living from truth. And in that recognition, the desire to constantly impress begins to lose its urgency. What once felt necessary for survival starts to feel like a burden that no longer belongs to the self that is emerging underneath the performance, gradually revealing a life that is no longer shaped by approval, but by inner clarity. Living alone is often misunderstood as a condition defined by what is missing. People hear it and immediately think of absence. Absence of companionship, absence of noise, absence of shared routines. But in its deeper reality, living alone is not defined by what is gone. It is defined by what finally becomes visible. When external influences quiet down, what emerges is not emptiness, but presence. A presence that had always been there, yet was often distorted by constant comparison, expectation, and emotional interference from others. In the company of others, identity is often shaped in response. You become aware of how you are perceived, how you are received, how you are positioned within the social space around you. This awareness is not inherently negative, but when it becomes constant, it begins to bend self-perception. You no longer experience yourself directly. You experience yourself through reflection. Living alone interrupts that reflective distortion. Without the immediate presence of others, there is less need to adjust, perform, or interpret yourself through external feedback. What remains is a more direct encounter with your own thoughts, habits, emotions, and patterns. At first, this encounter can feel unfamiliar. The mind, accustomed to external reference points, may try to recreate them internally. It may replay conversations, imagine judgments, or reconstruct imagined audiences. But gradually, as attention settles, these projections lose intensity. What begins to surface is a quieter, more consistent awareness that is not reacting to anyone else. It is simply observing. In this state, you begin to recognize how much of your previous self-understanding was shaped by contrast. Who you thought you were in relation to others rather than who you are in your own uninterrupted presence. Living alone allows these layers of distortion to soften. Emotional reactions are no longer immediately influenced by another person's tone or expression. Decisions are no longer shaped by immediate approval or resistance. Even time feels different, less segmented by social expectation, and more aligned with personal rhythm. In this space, you begin to notice patterns that were previously hidden beneath interaction. How you respond to uncertainty, how you handle silence, how your thoughts move when they are not being redirected by conversation. As this awareness deepens, presence becomes more tangible. It is not a dramatic realization, but a subtle shift in perception. You start to experience yourself without needing to explain yourself. There is less urgency to justify choices or narrate identity. Instead, there is a growing familiarity with simply being. This familiarity does not depend on validation or recognition. It is sustained by direct experience. In this way, living alone becomes less about separation from others and more about removal of distortion layers that once blurred self-perception. What remains is not a diminished version of life, but a clearer one where internal signals are no longer constantly overwritten by external input, and the self is experienced in a more uninterrupted form, steady awareness that continues unfolding without needing reflection from anything outside, quietly existing as it is. Expanding into a space where identity is no longer negotiated through others, but sensed directly in its own uninterrupted state, that continues to reveal itself without interruption or comparison or need to be defined through anything beyond itself. Peace begins in a subtle but profound shift, one that does not announce itself loudly or arrive with dramatic change, but unfolds quietly when a person stops looking outward for constant confirmation of their worth. For much of life, people are taught to seek signals from the world around them to determine their value, whether through praise, recognition, approval, or even simple acknowledgement. This creates a habit of external measurement, where inner certainty is replaced by external response, and self-understanding becomes dependent on how others react. Over time, this dependence shapes perception in powerful ways. A person may begin to feel worthy only when appreciated, and uncertain when ignored. Silence from others can feel like rejection, while attention can feel like validation of existence itself. In this condition, peace becomes difficult because peace is no longer generated internally, but borrowed from fluctuating external conditions that are never stable or guaranteed. The mind remains in a constant state of anticipation, waiting for cues that confirm safety, acceptance, or belonging. This ongoing search for confirmation gradually distances a person from their own inner stability. Decisions become influenced by imagined responses rather than authentic intention. Even in solitude, the mind continues to simulate audiences, replaying conversations or projecting future judgments. The self becomes fragmented between who it is and who it believes it needs to be in order to be accepted. This fragmentation prevents deep rest because rest requires internal permission, not external approval. The turning point begins when a person starts to recognize that no amount of external validation can create lasting peace. It can offer temporary relief, but it cannot stabilize identity. That realization does not come as rejection of the world, but as a quiet understanding that the world was never meant to be the final authority on one's inner worth. With this understanding, attention slowly begins to shift inward, not as withdrawal, but as reorientation towards something more consistent and less conditional. As this shift deepens, peace begins to take a different form. It is no longer dependent on being seen or understood in a particular way. Instead, it becomes a steady presence that exists even in uncertainty. The need to prove, explain, or justify begins to lose intensity, replaced by a quieter trust in one's own perception and being. Life becomes less about performing for acceptance and more about living in alignment with what feels true internally. In this space, the world no longer holds the final verdict on identity. Opinions are still heard, but they no longer define direction. Approval may still be appreciated, but it is no longer required for stability. The mind begins to rest in its own foundation, rather than constantly reaching outward for reinforcement. And this resting creates a kind of clarity that was previously interrupted by constant seeking. Thoughts slow down, emotional reactivity softens, and a deeper sense of presence becomes available without effort or negotiation. Eventually, this state reveals a different relationship with existence itself, where peace is not something granted by external conditions, but something recognized within, independent of shifting responses or changing circumstances. A quiet continuity that remains even when no one is watching or affirming or acknowledging. A presence that no longer asks for permission from the world to exist, and instead simply stands within its own certainty, while the need for confirmation finally dissolves into a quieter way of being that no longer depends on